I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're looking at a poem that was written in San Francisco. This is part of our Not Made in China Chinese Literature series. What's the poem?
The poem is called Number 41.
Poem number 41. Wow, that sounds like some postmodern...
It is. It's all about the number 41. It's pretty boring, actually. I don't know why we chose it, but we chose it, Lee, because as you and I have talked about, we are so resolutely apolitical, unopinionated, uncolored by recent events and everything else. We stick to the pure aesthetic beauty of literature, right?
That's right. Although we do recognize that immigration has been an important political topic recently.
Right.
We are avoiding any discussion of that by going back to the early 20th century.
And talking about a Chinese immigrant scrawling a poem on his plight into the wall of his detention cell as an immigrant. But that has nothing to do, that's purely coincidental.
You're absolutely right, Rob. Thank you for being completely sincere about that.
And in fact, the entire Chinese podcast team, from the research and marketing departments on down, are resolutely apolitical. So this is something we need to confirm.
So for those of y'all who aren't aware, the immigration in America has an interesting history that's actually quite closely connected with China, although sometimes that the historiography, when you learn about history of immigration in America, oftentimes that's not discussed.
Or if it's discussed, it's usually discussed solely in connection with the railroad, and then it sort of disappears.
So the first kind of racialized American immigration system began in 1883 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Just based off of where you came from, you could be denied admission to the United States. And this is the very first attempt by the U.S. government to control immigration, really. And it led to our current immigration system. And some scholars argue that there is this continuity between the racialized control of the Chinese Exclusion Act and today's immigration system. We're going to avoid that because we do try and avoid politics. But from 1883 to 1910, immigrants arrived in San Francisco, and there was a housing for them, a kind of prison that tried to determine whether or not they were legally allowed to immigrate into the United States. There was this whole system called paper sons and paper daughters. So Chinese immigrants would claim someone as a son or daughter as a way to allow them to get around the immigration system. And since there wasn't that much proof, it just kind of, a lot of people were able to duck the rules of the immigration system. 1910, there is a holding facility constructed on Angel Island, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. So from 1910, when Angel Island was constructed, to 1940, when it was closed up and the Chinese Exclusion Act was pretty much stopped, I think maybe a little less than 200,000, mostly Chinese immigrants, passed through Angel Island. Some of them were kept in holding cells for months. And we actually have this remarkable corpus of literature from what they scrawled onto the walls there. Now, the story of that is actually even interesting because 1940, Angel Island goes from being a detention center for Chinese people to a U.S. military combat training facility. And I believe they actually put wood over the walls. And after that, after the war, it was turned over to, I believe, the state of California, and a park ranger actually discovered some of these poems just before they were about to tear.
That's bananas. Can you imagine that being the person that discovers this stuff? Like, why? There's just all of this writing on the walls.
It almost feels like this.
Like, it's not drawings of body parts. It's, and what to do with them. It's lined poetry.
Yeah, it seems like Howard Carver, Tutankhamun kind of moment,
right?
Just kind of stumbling onto something that's this incredibly valuable body of literature. So we're looking, there are, I think, 200 plus poems that have been discovered in the area so far. We're just looking at one. Rob, you were the one who picked out this poem specifically. Why this particular poem? Well, hang on. Maybe we should read the poem first.
We'll read it with just a super quick introduction. I'll mention the reason I chose this has nothing to do with the specific writer, because
We don't know anything
I
about
mean,
the
we know the writer's name, right? And that's it, basically.
And we know where he's from.
And we know where he's from.
Taishan.
Yeah, in the southern part of China. And I'll get into a little bit why this is the one that really stuck out to me. But I'll just read the poem. I'll read the translation first. This is the translation that it's from the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. I do not see a listed translator, which is unfortunate. Anyway, here's the English
Translators aren't important.
Wow, like we just lost half of our listeners just tuned out. Well done, Lee. Here's the translation. After leaping into prison, I cannot come out. From endless sorrows, tears and blood streak. The Jing Wei Bird carries its gravel to fill its old grudge. The migrating wild goose complains to the moon, mourning his harried life. When Ziqing was in distant lands, who pitied and inquired after him? When Ranji reached the end of the road, he shed futile tears. The scented grass and hidden orchids complain of withering and falling. When may I be allowed to soar at my own pleasing?
So why choose this poem, Rob? There are lots of different poems. Why choose?
Well, first, before we do that, let's just simply remark on how I'm using the word remark twice, but remarkable it is that people would choose to express themselves in this time in poetry, right? We have other podcasts dealing with this question, but poetry means something very different in Chinese culture than certainly in American culture. There are more, I would argue, avenues for even political expression in poetry in Chinese history, at least in a form that allows you to share emotionally how you are in a way that's not immediately detectable, right? If you were just going to say, man, I hate this government, you could do that, but then you'd probably get slammed for it somewhere along the line. This is different. It's also elevating. In order to write poetry, and then we'll get into in a second this specific kind of poetry as well, you had to really be smart. You couldn't just pick it up on the street, right? You had to be educated to do this. So it was a mark of sophistication, as it is in, I think, most cultures. I should point out that the poem itself is very, very regular, classical lined yuefu poem.
Yeah, this is a 7
per line. Every line has exactly 7 characters, 8 lines, which is a fairly standard length for a yuefu poem. So the writer of this, now there are other kinds of styles of poetry, lots of styles of poetry actually in the classical tradition. The Song poems, the Songzi, the lyric poems from the Song dynasty tend to be sort of a lot freer. Just go with it. Like they're different line lengths. They're supposed to have been adapted to all the songs. Yuefu is much more, it's not the most regular, obviously, kind of poetry in the classical tradition, but there were still a lot more rules involved with this than a lot of other styles.
Yeah, and this author is definitely familiar with those rules. He's also doing something that's quite interesting. He's making a lot of classical, very astute classical.
And that was going to be my next point, is that, go for it, yeah.
Very astute classical allusions. And just to kind of bring some of these out. So the Jing Wei Bird that Rob mentioned, the Jing Wei it's a daughter of the Chinese mythological figure Nuwa. Nuwa was actually married to Fu Xi, the creator of Chinese writing. So Nuwa is very big in Chinese mythology. And her daughter transmorphed into a bird that supposedly brought a rock from the Western mountains to the Eastern Oceans, that is from sort of the Himalayas or the Taklamakan Desert, that area at this time, to the Pacific Ocean or the body of water between Japan and China, and tried to fill up the ocean. And this is actually even a Chengyu today. Jingwei Tianhai is actually a common Chengyu that just means hardworking.
Sisyphus, basically.
Yeah, Sisyphean. Yeah, there we go. Ziqing, so the line, when Ziqing was in distant lands, who pitied and inquired after him. That's actually an allusion to a Han Dynasty diplomat who was captured by the Xiongnu, one of several Han Dynasty diplomats captured by the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu, by the way, are the same people that we know in the West as the Huns. The Han Dynasty may have pushed them out of the lands of modern-day Mongolia and pushed them all the way east to the Roman Empire. But Ziqing was captured and imprisoned for, I think, 19 years by the Xiongnu. So, it's not that we don't want to unpack everything in this poem. We'll put it up when we put the poem up on the website. But what's important is that this writer, Li Gengbo, really, really knew his classical allusions. And he's not only observing a very particularly difficult style of well-regulated poetry, he's also like lacing it with all these classical allusions that, like I had to look up. And what's fascinating is that the story that's always told about Chinese immigration to America is that it's these kind of redneck, uneducated Chinese folks from southeastern China who are just going for the money.
Just taking our jobs.
No, we're not going to.
Oh, sorry, we're not going to be political.
We're not going to be political. No. But Li Gengbo, I mean, he may have been coming. We have no idea.
No.
We know nothing about him. But we can say clearly just by reading his poetry, which is randomly discovered, carved into this building, we can say that Li Gengbo knew his classical references.
And what's interesting about that, and this is the reason one of the main reasons I chose this poem, is the wealth of classical references, but also because of those, it would have been very, very difficult to communicate to people exactly how you were educated. Because he was educated in something that nobody in the United States, unless they spoke Chinese, could possibly understand. And really, even if you did speak Chinese, it's not like you and I, just as soon as we started learning Chinese, blam, we're right into the classical poetry tradition. It takes a long time to learn this stuff, right?
To be fair, I think that when Westerners studied Chinese back in this era, and I'm thinking of Mario Recchi, I think they did pretty much start out reading this.
I don't know if they did. And I know they do read, like there are children's primers in China, like when they start school.
Jing.
Those, but then the Chinese, there's a lot of the school reading books have like this kind of poem. So fair enough. But if you're a Westerner, you're not necessarily, this is sort of getting a feel to the point. This would be people who studied Chinese. How many people were actually studying Chinese at this period in San Francisco? Not many, if any, right? So if you were an immigration officer and this person who knows, maybe he spoke great English. Somehow I doubt it, just because I don't think that was the norm. Let's say he spoke some English. Now you're going to judge by, well, this guy can't really speak. He's clearly coming here because he wants to live here, which means things must suck where he's from, et cetera, et cetera. You have no basis for understanding exactly how educated this person is. And yet, based on this poem, very educated.
Super well educated.
Not just very well educated, but this is a pretty good poem. I mean, we're not talking, we can't compare him to Du Fu, obviously. This is not Du Fu held in a detention cell, but for a random poem scrawled on a wall, this is a pretty good poem.
Maybe. So honestly, I would encourage the listener to go take a look at the website that we're using. This is the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We're looking at poem number 41. Rob, I think that Li Gengbo's poem number 41 is actually one of the worst poems on this page.
Wow.
There are many other better poems. What I think is really fascinating, and I'm glad you chose it, is that it's so laced with these classical allusions that we can say Li Gengbo was not only very intelligent, but he was also so super well educated. And to be super well educated in Chinese largely meant you were of a kind of the upper crust,
right,
in terms of class. You can't, no kids from a poor family. I mean, there are stories of kids from poor families learning the Confucian classics and mastering them. But in reality, that's very difficult. You just have to have a lot of time sitting around reading these boring texts. And most of these kids were working and contributing to their family's economy. I think there are actually much better poems in this collection.
I would agree, yes.
And there are some that are actually there is a poem that alludes to Li Bai. So there is a poem that actually alludes to Li Bai. I'm looking at poem number 24, which is called Random Thoughts Deep at Night. And it does seem to be clearly drawing off of one of Li Bai's most famous poems.
Right, the one about looking at the moon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually think this is a much more interesting poem, but it doesn't say as much in terms of the socio-political points. That
and I think one of the reasons that I chose this poem because of its classical references is because of the opacity for any sort of, even for, it's in some ways, even for us, we had to look these references up. I say you had to look these references up, whatever. Let's be honest, I didn't look anything up. I just went, wow, that's hard. I don't know what that means. That must be cool. Whereas
comp literature.
That's just
there's comparative literature for you.
Those of us in comp lit depend on our national literature colleagues to do all the work for us while we come up with the interesting and publishable arguments. But it's fascinating to see this because there's a level of access with the best of, say, Li Bai Du Fu, even some of the song lyric poems, when it's writing so much about nature, about the moon, about feelings. I've taught Du Fu to undergrads, and they're very surprised at how accessible some of his stuff is. Not when you start getting classical references. Then everyone goes, what is this talking about? And that's part of the point. Well, a Chinese reading audience, they would know exactly what these were. Like, no question. It would be like us using Sisyphus or Samson or Moses. Any classical reference in our culture, you wouldn't even ask what it is. But as soon as you try to cross over, what? And it's interesting because this is such a fascinating part of immigration. It reminds me of my favorite writer, the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1980. Yeah. He was a giant of Slavic poetry for years and years. But when he taught at Berkeley, people didn't have any idea who he was. And when he won the Nobel Prize in 1980, they asked Miłosz, hey, so, how's this been? How do you feel about it? He says, well, I'm mostly happy about it because they gave me a parking space close to the door, right? Because no one knew that he was even a big deal until he won an award, but they all knew, right? Because how would you have any idea, right? In your midst, you have one of the greats. You really don't even know.
So in other words, framing poetry and context is super important. And if you lack that context of the kind of Chinese cultural understanding, right, and the literary understanding, then you're just going to kind of be lost when you see that. And I imagine that's what this California State Park official, when they're going to preparing to tear down this whole Angel Island facility, which Angel Island, again, is kind of like the Ellis Island of Chinese Americans, in the same way that all of these people came through Ellis Island.
Right.
All of these Europeans came through.
Irish, Italians, et cetera.
Jews. Mm-hmm. I think that Angel Island has that same kind of resonance for a lot of Chinese Americans, right, but it's not as the narrative of Angel Island has not entered nearly as deeply into the American historiological context as Ellis Island has.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that one of the things we're trying to do is, with this particular podcast, is try and get that out there, that there is this incredibly beautiful, if disturbing, work of art or corpus of poetry that is there in this. And we would like to encourage y'all to go check it out if you're in the Bay Area.
Yeah. It's funny because I've been to the Bay Area a bunch of times. I've never been. But it's well worth reading, and presentation is everything. If I just had a book of these poems and that's it, I didn't know where they were from or who wrote them, I'd go, not bad. But knowing that it's written by an immigrant and they wrote it
literally carved into the wall. Yeah.
That's a different thing entirely.
I think it also speaks to the power that literature, particularly in a Chinese context, can have, the emotional waves that can wash over people in a Chinese context that maybe is more difficult for people today, I think, to understand. Although, right, I mean, I don't know if that's...
Well, no, I think I would have to agree. Although, I think that's one of the things that gets lost. And I'm only going to just mention this briefly. Otherwise, we'll get ourselves into a 3-hour conversation. When artistic forms really open up and just completely change, because by 1910, the Qing dynasty is not yet overthrown. It's about a year away from finally crumbling and being tossed out the window. But, the civil service exams, the long-running, several thousand-year-old exams, were really only gotten rid of a decade or so before this. So
1905.
Yeah, exactly. Well, or so, but I was thinking 02 for some reason. But anyway, and decade sounds cooler than 5 years. I don't know. It's just, it has more weight. I'm a poet. You're not.
I like facts, Rob.
Yeah, that's why you're in the non-publishable area of academia. Anyway, I'm going to be famous. But no, but it's you're still dealing with an accepted sort of corpus, right? A canon, right? These are things you learn if you want to sound smart. And even after the exams are over, this is still what you read. And to some extent, even today, right? Even if you want to demonstrate you're smart and you can recite Du Fu or Li Bai, that says something. If you can recite Haizi, I think people will think you're cool, but not necessarily smart, That's a horribly superficial gloss, but
no, I think there's some validity to that. And I mentioned that the poem alludes to a Chengyu,
right?
That is Jing Wei Tianhai. So the fact that people are still like, when Chinese people use Chinese, if you use those Chengyu that allude to classical things,
right,
rhetorically, it's much more powerful. And I think that in the poem that we're looking at, poem number 41, rhetorically, one of the things that would make it powerful for a Chinese reader at the time is that it's got all of these cool classical
exactly. And it ties, it's an empowering gesture as well. This person in a position of total disempowerment is connecting himself consciously by the form he's using to the great masters of the Chinese language. Not comparable in this. I mean, he's not saying I am Du Fu, but he's connecting himself to the same tradition, right? He's calling to mind much older and more venerable sources in a place where none of that exists. So it's a way of adding power to his situation.
Rob, I think it's about time that we wrap up. Any final thoughts on poem number 41 from Angel Island Immigration
Just
Center?
Everybody go read the collection.
It's not super tough. I mean, it's right there online.
Solid. Yeah.
We'll post
the link up anyway, right?
Yeah, we'll put the link up
for sure. And read it. We're not political. We're not going to make a huge political statement, but this is an interesting period in American history. This particular aspect, like Lee mentioned, how many of you know that much about Angel Island? Probably a lot if you studied Chinese literature, but if not, you probably don't know that much, right?
I'll bet most people don't. If I could recommend one book,
go for it.
For thinking about this period, Erica Lee has a book called At America's Gates, which looks at the history of Chinese immigration to America after 1883, after the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think it's a fascinating read. She offers a lot of insights. I would highly recommend that y'all pick up a copy. It doesn't talk anything about the poetry as far as I can remember, but it has a lot on the history that will contextualize these poems for you.
So pick that up, check out the poems and the rest of this website, and enjoy.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.